The air hung heavy and damp over District 17, a persistent, chilling drizzle coating the forgotten alleyway where Silas had sought meager shelter. His breath misted visibly in the single beam of a broken street lamp, illuminating the worn cardboard he used for a mattress. The late hour usually afforded a degree of anonymity, a brief respite from the aggressive pulse of the city, but tonight the silence was broken not by traffic, but by the heavy, deliberate scrape of 3 pairs of boots approaching the mouth of the alley. Silas instinctively pulled the thin, threadbare blanket tighter around his shoulders, attempting to shrink into the shadows of the dumpster, a futile gesture given the confined space. The 3 figures were local knowledge, a minor predatory crew known for targeting the weakest links in the urban environment, fueled by cheap adrenaline and the assumption of consequence-free action. Their names were irrelevant. Their presence was the definition of immediate threat. The tallest, a man with a heavy, flat face and a chipped tooth, stopped directly in front of Silas, blocking the only clear path out. Well, the tall man began, his voice low and grating, carrying the metallic tang of stale cigarettes and contempt. Look what the rain dragged in. Still hoarding prime real estate, old man. The other 2 flanked him, their posture relaxed, broadcasting absolute control over the situation. This was not a negotiation. It was an extraction. Silas said nothing, his eyes fixed on the muddy, cracked pavement between them. He knew the protocol. Resist and suffer injury. Comply and lose the little he possessed. Compliance was often the only survival mechanism available. The second man, shorter and quicker, leaned down, his face inches from Silas's. We're just collecting the neighborhood tax, Pops. Got anything valuable today? Maybe that fancy watch you used to flash? Silas swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hadn't owned a watch in decades, but argument was useless. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, the sum total of his efforts that day, intended for a hot meal in the morning. He extended the bill, his hand trembling slightly. The tall man snatched the money, holding it up dismissively. $10, that barely covers the inconvenience of looking at you. He crumpled the bill and tucked it into his pocket without ceremony. The third man, who had been silent, suddenly kicked the stack of waterlogged newspapers Silas used as a pillow, sending them scattering across the wet ground. Check the bag, see if he's got any useful electronics. They always hide something better than this. The implied threat in the action was clear. They were moving past simple theft into deliberate harassment and destruction of shelter. As the short man moved to grab the worn canvas duffel bag that held Silas's few possessions, a spare shirt, a tattered book, a small photo, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the ambient noise of the alley. It was not a sound of approach, but a displacement of silence, a momentary void in the background hum of the city that felt unnaturally sharp. None of the 3 aggressors registered it. Their focus was too narrow, too consumed by the act of petty dominance. The short man was halfway to the duffel bag when the movement initiated. It was executed with a precision and speed that defied the cramped, slick conditions of the alley. From the deep shadows near the fire escape landing, a dark shape detached itself from the wall. The movement was fluid, economical, and devoid of wasted energy. The short man's elbow was suddenly, violently immobilized, snapped back into a painful hyperextension that elicited a sharp, involuntary gasp, instantly cutting off his predatory momentum. He stumbled, clutching his arm, his eyes wide with shock and confusion, unable to process the source of the sudden acute pain. There was no warning, no shouted demand, only the cold, hard application of physics against flesh. The tall man, momentarily startled by his partner's sudden collapse, spun around clumsily. His attention split between the groaning figure on the ground and the new presence. The shadow was not large, but they were formidable. Clad in dark, practical clothing, utility boots, cargo pants, a heavy, unidentifiable jacket with multiple secure pockets, their face was obscured by the deep shadow cast by a low-profile cap and the ambient darkness, rendering specific features indistinguishable. The focus was entirely on efficiency. As the tall man turned, the protector was already moving, exploiting the momentary disorientation. A low, sweeping motion connected with the tall man's supporting leg, a specialized trip technique designed to cause an immediate, uncontrolled fall rather than a simple loss of balance. He hit the wet pavement hard, the air driven from his lungs in a ragged expulsion. He tried to scramble back up, his hands slipping on the grime, but the protector stepped in, planting a precise, non-damaging but utterly demoralizing pressure point strike just below the sternum. The pain was sharp, intense, and transient, sufficient to incapacitate without causing lasting injury. The tall man curled into a fetal position, momentarily paralyzed by the shock. The third aggressor, who had finally registered the impossibility of the situation, instinctively reached for the heavy metal flashlight tucked into his waistband, the standard tool for intimidation they employed. He managed to withdraw it halfway before the protector closed the distance again. This time the engagement was faster, almost a blur. The protector's hand snaked out, not towards the man's weapon, but towards the wrist holding it. A quick rotational lock followed, twisting the man's joint in a manner that instantly dropped him to his knees, his grip failing completely as the flashlight clattered uselessly onto the ground. The aggressor gasped, not in aggression, but in pure, terrified pain, understanding instantly that the person before them was operating on an entirely different plane of competence. This was not a street fight. It was a clinical dismantling. Silence returned to the alley, heavier now, punctuated only by the shallow, panicked breathing of the three subdued men and the continued, steady drumming of the rain. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 15 seconds. Silas, frozen against the dumpster, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of terror and disbelief, his mind struggling to reconcile the sudden, brutal efficiency of the defense with the usual lawlessness of the area. The protector stood over the three figures, their posture relaxed but coiled, radiating an authority that needed no weapon or shouting to enforce compliance. They did not threaten further violence. The demonstration had been sufficient. They simply waited until the three aggressors managed to look up, meeting the invisible gaze from beneath the cap. The message was clear. The immediate threat was over, but the consequences of returning would be geometric. The protector then performed an unexpected action. They stepped towards the tall man, who was still wheezing, and retrieved the crumpled $10 bill from his pocket. They tossed it onto Silas's blanket. They retrieved the scattered newspapers and stacked them back neatly near the dumpster. Then, without a word, they glanced briefly at Silas, a quick assessing look that held no judgment, only confirmation of his safety. The three thugs began to scramble away, their bravado shattered, replaced by a desperate need for distance. The tall man tried to speak, muttering a promise of future retribution, but the words caught in his throat. As the protector took a single, deliberate step towards him, he decided silence and immediate flight were the better options. They retreated awkwardly, two of them supporting the injured arm of the third, vanishing back out onto the street where their initial confidence had reigned supreme only minutes before. The alley was quiet again. Silas slowly, cautiously, picked up the wet $10 bill, his fingers numb. He looked up, searching for his mysterious defender, but the space near the fire escape was empty. The shadow had vanished as quickly and silently as they had appeared, melting back into the urban geometry. Only the lingering scent of wet concrete and the faint rhythmic dripping of the rain remained. Silas was safe, his meager possessions restored, but the overwhelming sense of violation and fear was replaced by a profound, unsettling confusion. Who was this person? Why did they choose to intervene for a man the city had long forgotten? He ran a trembling hand over his face. Then, from the distance, cutting through the damp air, came the unmistakable rising wail of police sirens, approaching rapidly, drawn by a distant report of disturbance, or perhaps merely patrolling too close to the scene. The timing was critical. If the protector had still been there, they would be moving now, disappearing into the labyrinth of the city's shadows and rooftops, leaving no witness, no trace, only the profound impact of their sudden, decisive justice. Silas knew he had to gather his composure quickly, before the flashing blue and red lights illuminated the scene and brought the inevitable questions he could not answer truthfully, questions that would lead back to the presence of the shadow. He folded the blanket around himself, the cold suddenly feeling sharper, the silence more menacing, realizing that while he was safe for now, the conflict he had just witnessed was far from over. The appearance of the protector had solved one problem but initiated a far larger, more dangerous chain of events, drawing attention to a dark corner of the city that preferred to remain unseen. He looked towards the fire escape, wondering if the shadow was still watching, ensuring the safety of the vulnerable, knowing they would not tolerate the return of predators. The sudden crescendo of sirens fractured the fragile silence, their lights painting the alley walls in aggressive, pulsing hues of red and blue. Silas tightened his grip on the thin blanket, dragging himself back from the edge of shock to the necessity of immediate, flawless deception. He knew the police response would be swift, efficient, and ultimately fruitless regarding the true nature of what had transpired, but his role as the sole witness had to be meticulously managed. He wiped the residue of cold sweat from his forehead, just as the first two officers, serious and heavily equipped, rounded the corner, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, momentarily blinding him. Silas adopted the posture of a distressed, harmless civilian, a man startled by noise, not by a choreographed act of self-defense carried out by an unseen entity. The questions began immediately, sharp and probing, designed to break through the initial haze of trauma. He reported only the noise, the sudden, sharp sounds of conflict, insisting he had seen nothing distinct, only shadows moving too quickly to register, focusing his narrative entirely on the fear of the attempted break-in, omitting any mention of the specialized gear, the silent efficiency, or the total absence of residual struggle that characterized the Shadow's work. He stressed the quick departure of the aggressors, claiming they fled the second the sirens were audible, a plausible lie that accounted for the lack of bodies or major damage. The officers, frustrated but professional, scoured the scene. They found the two men neutralized by the Shadow, one slumped against the wall, perfectly unconscious from a precise strike to the temple, the other secured with specialized, non-standard restraints hidden skillfully in the debris, ensuring his rapid discovery by the police but obscuring the method of incapacitation. The Shadow had ensured the men were detained without permanent harm, adhering strictly to a code that prioritized justice and protection over vengeance. But the scene itself was confusing. There was no clear victim to interview, only a terrified witness, Silas, and two suspects who mysteriously collapsed without a struggle, their weapons scattered nearby. The lack of clear evidence of who had overpowered them, no footprints, no dropped fibers, no witnesses beyond Silas's deliberately vague account, created an immediate, frustrating dead end for the responding team. This efficiency was the signature of the Protector, a testament to months of preparation, ensuring that the authorities could handle the aftermath without ever truly identifying the source of the intervention. Meanwhile, blocks away, in a dimly lit, nondescript warehouse serving as the central hub for the network that preyed upon the vulnerable sections of the city, the news arrived. Vigilante, the leader, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a profound, predatory cruelty, listened to the panicked report over a secured line. His face remained impassive, betraying none of the simmering rage that instantly ignited in his eyes. Two operatives taken out, neutralized with professional precision, their equipment recovered, confirming they had been actively involved in a targeted extraction. Vigilante processed the information not as a loss of personnel, but as an intolerable insult to his organization's dominance. This was not random street violence. The method of incapacitation, the surgical precision, the clean sweep of evidence, it all suggested organization, training, and most disturbingly, intent. Someone was actively protecting this specific corner of the city, interfering directly with their established operations. Vigilante slammed the phone down, the sound echoing sharply in the large, empty space. He immediately mobilized his core intelligence unit. The priority shifted from the initial operation to identifying the interference. "This is not a territorial dispute," he stated to his lieutenants, his voice low and dangerous. "This is a challenge. Find out who has the audacity to move against us in our own territory. Check the residents, check the informants, check the usual suspects. If this is a rival gang, they will pay. If this is something else, something organized and dedicated to justice," he spat the word out like a curse, "then we escalate immediately. We will not be humiliated. The one who did this is now the target, and we will make an example out of anyone they try to protect." The escalation was now inevitable. The Shadow's intervention had secured the safety of the immediate targets, but it had simultaneously drawn the full, focused wrath of a dangerous criminal enterprise onto the area. High above the chaos, perched on the dark parapet of a forgotten factory building, the Shadow watched the police activity diminish. The Protector, cloaked entirely in tailored, non-reflective material, was a study in stillness, processing the operational fallout. The risk assessment was immediate. Success achieved in neutralizing the immediate threat and securing the targets, but failure in maintaining total anonymity as the intervention was too decisive to be dismissed as luck. The Shadow knew Vicente's operation was not tolerant of losses or humiliation. The response would be swift, aggressive, and aimed at the community itself, seeking to flush out the Protector or punish those perceived to be under its defense. The need for proactive defense shifted into high gear. The Shadow accessed a small custom-built device, cycling through encrypted feeds and local traffic cameras, building a detailed profile of the immediate neighborhood's vulnerabilities. The Shadow's preparation was exhaustive. They had identified 3 primary escape routes for the vulnerable residents, paths through abandoned infrastructure that were unknown to the police and, crucially, to Vicente's street network. The Protector began the subtle work of reinforcing these routes, placing small, easily accessible caches of essential supplies, first aid kits, communication relays, specialized flares, in locations only they and a few trusted, anonymous contacts within the community knew about. This was the silent architectural work of defense, building a fortress around people who didn't even know they were inside one. The Shadow moved with fluid grace across the rooftops, their movements economical, utilizing every shadow and architectural feature to remain unseen, a ghost performing vital maintenance on the city's hidden defenses. The cold air bit at their exposed skin, but the focus was absolute. They circled back toward Silas's apartment building, not to interact, but to ensure the witness remained safe, understanding that Vicente's intelligence teams would prioritize identifying anyone who might have seen or assisted the intervention. A quick sweep of the surrounding utility boxes revealed a freshly installed micro-camera, sophisticated enough to evade standard police detection, placed strategically to monitor Silas's comings and goings. The Shadow disabled it instantly, leaving no physical trace of interference, only a brief, untraceable surge of static that would corrupt the recorded feed. This confirmed the immediate danger. Vigilante was already moving, focusing on the periphery, casting a wide net. The stakes had been drastically raised from simple protection to a complex game of espionage and counter-surveillance. The Protector paused, resting a hand on the cold, weathered stone of a chimney stack. The moral dilemma was acute. Every action taken to protect the vulnerable increased the danger to their own life and deepened the conflict with a powerful, ruthless enemy. Yet the choice was never truly a choice. The system had failed these people repeatedly. The vacuum of justice required an immediate, tangible force. Back in the warehouse, Vicente's intelligence team, utilizing advanced digital forensics and rapid interrogation of low-level informants, managed to isolate a pattern. The area where the attack occurred was known for its high concentration of undocumented families and elderly residents, people who avoided interaction with official channels. More importantly, they found vague, anecdotal whispers, stories of strange occurrences, of predators suddenly disappearing, of threats vanishing before they materialized. They pieced together the fragmented accounts, realizing this wasn't a one-off event. There was a dedicated, persistent interference pattern. They didn't have a name, but they had a concept. The Shadow. The name itself, whispered nervously among the vulnerable, was now confirmed as a tangible threat. Vigilante reviewed the consolidated file, his lips curling into a grim smile. So, a moral guardian, he muttered, tapping a gloved finger on the surveillance photograph of the alley where his men were found. A ghost playing hero. Ghosts are easy to catch when you threaten what they protect. Vigilante shifted his strategy entirely. Instead of hunting the Shadow directly, they would target the source of the Shadow's concern. He ordered an immediate, highly visible operation scheduled for the next night, a coordinated sweep of the sector, designed not to loot or harm, but to sow terror, forcing the Protector out of the shadows and into a compromised position. This move was designed to be bait, a calculated risk to draw out the Vigilante, forcing them to choose between their own safety and the safety of dozens of innocent lives. The Shadow received the first fragments of this new threat through their network of contacts. A sudden aggressive increase in street activity, unknown faces scouting the area, and a chilling sense of impending catastrophe communicated through hushed warnings. The Protector understood the new operational calculus instantly. Vigilante was not interested in recovering his men. He was setting a trap, using the community as leverage. The escalation was complete. The conflict had moved past isolated acts of defense and into a full strategic confrontation. The Shadow checked the integrity of their gear, the specialized tools designed for non-lethal incapacitation and rapid extraction. They confirmed the placement of the emergency caches and mentally reviewed the evacuation protocols. Sleep was no longer an option. The city was silent, but beneath the surface, the tension was a taut wire ready to snap. The Protector moved toward the highest vantage point in the sector, preparing for a long, dangerous vigil, accepting the mantle of the hunted. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were personal, directed at the heart of the community the Shadow had sworn to defend. The night was vast, cold, and promised a showdown that would define the limits of the Shadow's commitment and the ruthlessness of their enemy. The final preparatory check, a subtle adjustment of the encrypted communication device, confirmed the connection to the emergency broadcast system. If necessary, the Shadow would initiate a full, coordinated evacuation, but that was the last resort. For now, the Protector would stand watch, waiting for the first sign of Vigilante's planned terror campaign, fully aware that the moment of direct, unavoidable conflict was now only hours away, and the fragile peace secured earlier was nothing more than the calm before a devastating storm. The Protector vanished back into the shadows, a sentinel guarding a line that the city's official mechanisms had long ignored, ready to face the full force of the threat they had deliberately provoked in the name of justice. The Shadow remained motionless atop the abandoned water tower overlooking the sprawling municipal market complex, a skeletal silhouette against the pale, polluted glow of the city's distant core. The air was heavy, tasting of ozone and industrial grit, a silent witness to the impending confrontation. Every fiber of the Protector's being was tuned to the frequencies of danger, the subtle change in the rhythm of the surrounding traffic, the absence of the usual nocturnal wildlife, the specific pattern of light reflecting off the deserted loading docks. The provocation had been successful. Vigilante was reacting, and his reaction was precisely the large, visible movement the Shadow needed to intercept. Time stretched, measured only by the slow, deliberate rotation of a distant searchlight on a neighboring warehouse roof. Then the silence fractured, not with a shout or a siren, but with the specific, low hum of modified internal combustion engines approaching from the south access road, vehicles moving with a calculated speed that indicated intent and secrecy. 3 utility vans, dark and unmarked, peeled away from the main road and entered the service alley adjacent to the market's main distribution center. The deployment was rapid and professional, suggesting military training among Vigilante's primary crew. 4 figures emerged from the first van, their bulky silhouettes indicating they carried more than sidearms. They moved toward the market's primary electrical nexus, the central nervous system of the entire complex. This was the target: infrastructural disruption intended to cause chaos and panic, exactly the type of systemic terror Vigilante specialized in. The Shadow's internal clock started counting down the critical seconds. 2 figures split off, heading toward the western wing, the location of the community resource center currently empty but structurally vital. The other 2 began accessing the junction box. The Shadow descended, utilizing the tower's internal maintenance ladder system for a silent, rapid drop, transitioning seamlessly to the adjacent rooftop. The initial engagement was tactical and designed for maximum disruption with minimum lasting injury. The 2 figures attempting to breach the junction box were focused entirely on their task, their concentration a critical vulnerability. The Shadow moved across the roofline like a ripple across still water, timing the jump perfectly to land directly behind the first man. A swift, localized strike to the next pressure point rendered the target momentarily unconscious before he could register the threat, his body collapsing silently against the metal casing of the junction box. The second man whirled, his weapon, a heavy reinforced industrial tool that could easily be used as a blunt weapon, raised instantly. The Shadow did not pause for negotiation. A specialized high-density kinetic dampener, disguised as a wrist-mounted flash device, discharged a focused electromagnetic pulse, momentarily overloading the man's sensory motor functions. He stumbled, his vision swimming, the heavy tool clattering harmlessly to the concrete as the Shadow applied a rapid joint lock to his elbow, twisting him away from the junction box and down onto the ground. The threat from the core team was neutralized in under 8 seconds. The devices they had been preparing to install, small self-contained incendiary charges wrapped in high-grade plastics, were immediately secured and rendered inert by the Shadow's specialized jamming equipment. However, the threat was not localized. The remaining crews were still active, The encrypted comms whispered a confirmation. The Western team had reached the community center loading bay and were breaching the reinforced door. The Shadow sprinted along the rooftop edge, the distance requiring a calculated risk. The transition involved a 15-foot gap between the buildings, complicated by a network of exposed conduit pipes. The jump was executed with flawless precision, the Shadow landing lightly on the adjoining roof, the impact absorbed entirely by the specialized boots. Below, 2 men were struggling with the door lock, their movements clumsy but determined. The Shadow positioned above them, utilizing the architecture itself as a weapon. A section of loose, heavy corrugated metal sheeting, strategically loosened days earlier during the initial reconnaissance, was dislodged and guided downward. It didn't fall on them, but rather crashed loudly and heavily into the alleyway directly beside them, the metallic cacophony forcing both men to recoil, covering their ears and momentarily dropping their tools in shock and disorientation. This momentary lapse was the opening. The Shadow dropped into the alleyway, landing silently behind the 2 stunned men. The sequence of disarmament was fluid. The first man, still dazed, found his arms suddenly pinned against his sides by a powerful specialized restraint cord applied with blinding speed. He struggled uselessly. The second man attempted to draw a concealed sidearm, but the Shadow's counter was already in motion. A precise low kick swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing onto his back. Before he could recover, the Shadow's weight pressed down on his chest, and a focused pressure point strike to the shoulder immobilized his dominant arm. Neither man was seriously injured, but both were completely incapable of continuing the attack or raising an alarm beyond the immediate area. The communication devices they carried were crushed underfoot, severing their link to Vigilante. But the silence that followed the successful neutralization of the 2 perimeter teams was deceptive. The Shadow knew Vigilante would never commit to a target of this magnitude without a central command presence and a contingency plan. A rapid sweep of the area confirmed the initial devices were non-functional. The focus shifted back to the vehicles. The 3rd utility van parked further down the service road was still occupied. As the Shadow approached, moving cautiously within the heavy shadows cast by the market's main facade, a figure emerged from the driver's side, a large, imposing man known only in police intelligence files as the Cleaner, Vicente's personal executor and logistics specialist. The Cleaner carried no obvious weapon, relying on sheer physical intimidation and brutal efficiency. The Cleaner saw the Shadow instantly, having anticipated the intervention. He did not shout or draw attention. His reaction was immediate and purely aggressive, a silent, powerful charge aimed at overwhelming the Protector through sheer force. This was a different kind of confrontation, not strategic disarmament, but a raw, physical engagement where the stakes were defined by endurance. The Shadow met the charge head-on, avoiding the Cleaner's massive, swinging blow designed to shatter bone. The Protector utilized the man's own momentum, redirecting his force into a nearby stack of empty wooden pallets, which splintered under the impact. The Cleaner recovered instantly, his breathing heavy, his focus absolute. He was a difficult opponent, relying on brute strength rather than finesse, making precise, non-lethal neutralization extremely challenging. The Shadow maintained distance, circling, looking for the structural weaknesses in the Cleaner's defense. The fight became a complex, rapid ballet of evasion and controlled counterstrikes. The Shadow delivered a series of rapid-fire impacts designed to temporarily stun and disorient, targeting major nerve clusters in the arms and legs. The Cleaner absorbed the blows with grim determination, his size and sheer mass acting as a shield. Frustration was a luxury the Shadow could not afford. The priority shifted: disable the van and confirm the location of Vigilante. During a brief grappling exchange, the Shadow managed to subtly introduce a small, powerful electromagnetic field generator onto the underside of the van's chassis. A quick command sequence initiated the device. A sudden, sharp electrical surge caused the van's interior lights to flicker violently before the engine completely died. The electronics short-circuited entirely. The Cleaner noticed the distraction, his eyes momentarily flicking toward the disabled vehicle. That split second was enough. The Shadow executed a complex maneuver, utilizing the Cleaner's momentarily diverted attention to deliver a sharp, focused strike to the solar plexus, followed by a lateral sweep that finally brought the massive man down winded and momentarily incapacitated, but still conscious and dangerous. The protector did not linger, immediately applying specialized restraint cuffs designed to tighten slightly with any significant movement, ensuring the cleaner remained secured. The van was inert. The initial teams were secured and the incendiary threat neutralized, but Vicente was still missing. The protector accessed the van's internal navigation system, utilizing an override code to bypass the security protocols. The system logs confirmed a critical recent destination, the old City Hall Annex 3 blocks north. It was the location of the city's emergency power bypass substation, a far more devastating target than the market itself. Vicente had used the market attack as a calculated diversion, sacrificing his primary crew to draw the Shadow's attention while he targeted the city's fundamental infrastructure. The true confrontation was not over. It was merely relocating, escalating the danger tenfold. The Shadow sprinted toward the northern access route, the sound of the rapidly approaching police sirens, triggered by the controlled disruption a block away, not by the confrontation itself, serving as a ticking clock. The protector had minutes, perhaps less, to reach the annex before Vicente executed his primary, catastrophic plan. The game of avoidance was over. The final, unavoidable confrontation with Vicente himself was now imminent, set against the backdrop of the city's most critical power grid. The tension coiled tight, stretching the limits of the Shadow's capabilities and moral commitment. The Shadow sprinted toward the northern access route, the sound of the rapidly approaching police sirens, triggered by the controlled disruption a block away, not by the confrontation itself, serving as a ticking clock. The protector had minutes, perhaps less, to reach the annex before Vicente executed his primary, catastrophic plan. The game of avoidance was over. The final, unavoidable confrontation with Vicente himself was now imminent, set against the backdrop of the city's most critical power grid. The tension coiled tight, stretching the limits of the Shadow's capabilities and moral commitment. The industrial district blurred into a monochrome tunnel of concrete and steel as the Shadow pushed their physical limits, the augmented suit compensating for the exhaustion accumulated over the preceding hours of intense engagement. The northern access was less guarded, relying on perimeter alarms and high-voltage fences, defenses tailored to deter opportunistic trespassers, not a determined, specialized infiltration. The air here was heavy with the metallic tang of ozone and the deep, unsettling hum of high-tension electricity, a constant, low-frequency threat that vibrated through the ground. The substation annex, a fortress of bland, windowless architecture, loomed ahead. Its exterior was crisscrossed with thick conduits and warning signs, a clear indication that any direct engagement involved risks far beyond typical urban combat. Vicente's target was the main relay control room, located deep within the structure, protected by layers of reinforced security doors. The Shadow calculated the ingress route, the maintenance tunnel adjacent to the cooling tanks, rarely monitored electronically, but requiring a precise high-risk traverse over live machinery. Utilizing the specialized magnetic grips on their gloves, the Shadow scaled the perimeter wall silently, dropping into the narrow service alley. The sirens were closer now, perhaps 2 minutes away from converging on the initial diversion site, which meant police presence would begin sweeping the surrounding industrial zone almost immediately. Time was a rapidly diminishing resource. The maintenance tunnel required the Shadow to navigate a tight crawl space, the sound of the high-voltage current hissing just centimeters above their helmet. They moved with a practiced economy of motion, every breath controlled, every slight shift of weight calculated to avoid touching the exposed, energized casing. The thermal signature scanner quickly cut through the darkness and the structural interference, revealing a single high-level thermal reading emanating from the central control hub, Vicente. He was alone, exactly as predicted. The man preferred to conduct his most devastating work in isolation, minimizing variables. Reaching the hub required bypassing 3 internal security doors. The Shadow used a focused, high-frequency kinetic pulse emitter, a tool designed purely for silent, non-destructive lock bypass, on the first heavy steel door. It clicked open almost instantly, the sound barely audible over the mechanical drone of the ventilation system. The second door was electronic, requiring a rapid, complex patch into the access panel. The Shadow connected a small shielded decryption unit, watching the complex stream of code scroll across the internal visor display. The algorithm was robust, suggesting a professional-grade installation, but the Shadow's customized software, built over years of studying infrastructure defense protocols, found the backdoor exploit within 15 seconds. The door slid open, revealing a narrow, brightly lit corridor leading directly to the control hub. This was the point of no return. The hum of the electricity intensified, a physical pressure against the eardrums. The final door was open. Vicente stood inside the massive control room, illuminated by the dozens of green and red indicator lights of the main power grid control board. He wasn't working on the primary breakers, which would have been too obvious and easily reversed. Instead, he had targeted the system's cascading fail-safes. Her complex, improvised electronic device, bristling with wires and a small digital countdown timer, was wired directly into the master synchronization unit, the heart that regulated the flow and stability of the entire regional network. The timer displayed 01:15:75 seconds. Vicente turned slowly, a smirk of absolute conviction settling on his face. He held a small remote trigger in one hand, but his attention was fixed on the Shadow. This was the conclusion he desired. "I knew you wouldn't be satisfied with the small game, Shadow." Vicente's voice echoed in the sterile room, calm and devoid of panic. "You chase the fire, but you ignore the true power, the control of the dark. This isn't about money or property damage. This is about showing them how easily their ordered world collapses." The Shadow took 2 measured steps into the room, assessing the distance, the device, and the high-voltage terminals surrounding Vicente. The moral equation was immediate and brutal. Disabling the device was paramount, but any rapid movement could provoke Vicente into hitting the trigger, initiating the network collapse instantly, rendering the protective action moot. "The collapse affects everyone, Vicente. The hospitals, the emergency services, the innocent people you claim to disregard," the Shadow stated, their voice modulated, deep and steady, cutting through the humming electricity. "Sacrifice is necessary for revelation," Vicente countered, raising the remote slightly, a subtle, threatening gesture. "You fight for the status quo, the comfortable lie. I fight for the truth of fragility." End of Chapter 2. Beginning of Chapter 3. The Shadow knew debate was futile. Vicente was a true believer in his destructive philosophy, immune to appeals to basic morality. The countdown ticked. 01:05. The confrontation was now a surgical strike under impossible time constraints. The Shadow shifted their stance imperceptibly, preparing for a sequence of simultaneous actions, neutralizing the man and disabling the device. The proximity to the high-voltage equipment meant firearms were out of the question. A stray bullet or even the concussive force of a projectile could trigger a massive lethal electrical surge. This required close quarters, non-lethal precision. The Shadow deployed 2 specialized sonic disruptors from their gauntlets, small, nearly silent bursts of focused energy aimed not at Vicente, but at the synchronization unit itself. The goal was not to disable the device yet, but to briefly overload the peripheral sensors Vicente was using to monitor the unit's status, creating a microsecond window of distraction. As the sensors flickered red, Vicente glanced instinctively toward the control panel, his attention fracturing for a fraction of a second. That fraction was all the Shadow needed. Pushing off the polished floor, the Shadow closed the 8-meter distance in a blur of motion, simultaneously releasing a non-conductive polymer net designed to instantly wrap and bind. Vicente, though sharp, was anticipating a physical charge, not a tactical restraint. The net enveloped his upper body, and the arm holding the trigger, pulling him off balance and away from the control console. As Vicente stumbled, struggling against the specialized fibers that tightened instantly upon contact, the Shadow was already past him, focused entirely on the improvised explosive device wired into the master unit. The timer read U0.48. The complexity of the wiring demanded specialized knowledge. Cutting the wrong wire would complete the circuit and trigger the device. The Shadow's visor displayed the schematics previously downloaded from city infrastructure databases, overlaid with real-time analysis of the current flow. 2 distinct leads were critical, the power bypass and the signal relay. Using a pair of insulated ceramic cutters, the Shadow targeted the power bypass line first. Snip. The timer did not stop, but a small secondary light on the device flickered out, the first stage of disarmament. Vicente roared, struggling violently within the polymer restraint. trying desperately to reach the remote trigger, now pinned uselessly against his chest. He was shouting incoherently about the necessity of darkness, the futility of resistance. The shadow ignored the noise, focusing entirely on the signal relay line. This was the final, most dangerous cut, requiring absolute stillness and precision. A thin strand of fiber optic cable ran parallel to the copper signal wire. The shadow had to sever the wire without damaging the surrounding systems. Outside, the distant, muffled sound of police sirens growing louder indicated they were circling the complex, drawn by the initial activity. The shadow had seconds until external interference became a factor. 0025. The shadow steadied their hand, the focused breathing technique stabilizing their nervous system, despite the adrenaline surging through their veins. The ceramic cutters aligned perfectly. Snip. The entire improvised device went dark. The countdown timer vanished. The low, ominous hum of the substation machinery remained steady, uninterrupted. The threat was neutralized. The city remained lit. The sudden silence from the device was deafening. Vicente stopped struggling, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound despair. His grand statement, his calculated chaos, had been diffused in the final moments. The shadow turned back to the restrained man, ensuring the polymer net was fully secured, rendering him immobile but unharmed. The priority was containment and extraction, not confrontation. The shadow accessed their external comms unit. Threat neutralized. Substation integrity confirmed. Target secured and immobilized near Control Hub Delta. This transmission was directed not to the police, but to a specific secure channel monitored by a trusted, anonymous intermediary. A fail-safe ensuring authorities would find Vicente and the evidence of the plot without compromising the Shadow's presence or identity. 008. The Shadow moved with extreme urgency, leaving Vicente secured but intact, a clear signal that the intervention was about prevention, not personal vengeance. The Shadow retreated. The police lights were now flashing visibly through the narrow slits of the substation's high windows. The escape route had to be swift and silent, retracing the path through the control hub, the service corridor, and back into the maintenance tunnel. The Shadow ensured no trace evidence of their presence remained. The decryption unit was detached and retracted, the steel door automatically locking behind them. The final challenge was the exit. The Shadow emerged from the maintenance tunnel, just as the first police vehicles, alerted by the initial diversion and now sweeping the area, approached the perimeter fence. The Shadow scaled the fence on the far shadowed side, using the high-voltage hum as acoustic cover. Dropping into the dense, overgrown brush of the adjacent abandoned rail yard, the Shadow vanished into the deepest shadow, carrying the weight of the successful, brutal night. The city was safe, but the message was clear. The fight against the deep, calculating threats like Vicente was far from over, and the personal cost of maintaining the order in the dark corners continued to rise exponentially. The Shadow moved silently, already calculating the next moves required to ensure Vicente's network was permanently dismantled, knowing that this victory was merely a pause in the ceaseless battle for urban stability. The Shadow moved silently, already calculating the next moves required to ensure Vicente's network was permanently dismantled, knowing that this victory was merely a pause in the ceaseless battle for urban stability. The dense foliage of the abandoned rail yard offered temporary sanctuary, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and rusting iron, a stark contrast to the sterile, pressurized environment of the subterranean facility. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest from the sudden, violent exertion, but the adrenaline maintained a tight, cold grip on the core systems. The Shadow navigated the twisted labyrinth of decommissioned tracks and gutted freight cars, the sound of distant sirens growing fainter, merging into the general nocturnal hum of the city. The primary objective was not merely escape, but complete, untraceable dissolution back into the urban fabric. Reaching the prearranged dead drop, a sealed, heavily shielded compartment beneath a derelict signal tower, the Shadow deposited the critical data storage unit, containing the entirety of Vicente's encrypted operational blueprints and digital ledgers, and the customized extraction tools. The weight of the equipment now shared momentarily provided a false sense of lightness. The next phase required absolute invisibility. The journey back to the secure observation platform, a location known only as the Eyrie, was a multi-stage process involving meticulously planned redundancies, 3 separate changes in vehicle, 2 lengthy traverses through obscure utility tunnels, and a complete change of external appearance, discarding the specialized suit for innocuous, neutral civilian clothing. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky in muted grays, the shadow was already high above the city. Observing the initial systemic shockwave from a distance, the Eyrie was not a luxurious hideout, but a functional command center, bristling with communication intercepts and analytical hardware. The data drive, once retrieved from the dead drop by a secondary automated system, was already being subjected to a deep decryption and analysis protocol. The initial reports filtering through the police scanners were predictably confused. Reports of a massive coordinated security breach, high-value assets missing, and a structural collapse localized to the deepest sublevels, cleverly masked by the initial explosive diversion. Law enforcement was treating the incident as a highly sophisticated internal corporate espionage attempt gone wrong, a necessary misdirection achieved by planting highly convincing digital breadcrumbs leading away from the truth. The operational analysis began immediately. The physical neutralization of Vigilante was a tactical necessity, removing the head of the operation, but the real victory lay in the acquired data. Scrolling through the initial decryption summaries, the shadow confirmed the extent of the network. Money laundering operations disguised as international infrastructure projects, deep political corruption involving several municipal figures, and the frighteningly detailed plan for controlling essential city services through manipulated public contracts. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the systemic infection remained. The data revealed dozens of mid-level managers and lieutenants scattered across the globe awaiting activation. This operation had been a surgical strike, but now the shadow held the keys to the entire cancerous structure. The dilemma was immediate and sharp. Release the data now, causing catastrophic, uncontrolled collapse and potential societal panic, or use it strategically, surgically dismantling the network piece by piece, minimizing collateral damage but prolonging the conflict. The shadow chose the path of measured, deliberate action. Uncontrolled chaos served no purpose. It merely created a vacuum for a new, equally ruthless entity to fill. The process of isolating key financial nodes began. Subtle data packets injected into various banking systems designed to trigger automated audits and regulatory flags, all leading back to shell corporations tied to Vigilante's structure, but doing so slowly, naturally, ensuring the collapse looked like a complex series of internal failures rather than a targeted strike. The city needed stability, not a revolution sparked by terrifying revelations about the true depth of its corruption. This required patience, a quality often tested by the urgency of the threat, and the acceptance that the fight would now transition from physical confrontation to digital warfare and strategic manipulation of the administrative apparatus. The weight of the night's actions settled heavily, not as guilt, but as a chilling confirmation of the necessary moral compromise. The extreme measures taken in the facility, the calculated use of fear and intimidation, were not acts of vengeance, but cold, tactical prerequisites for success. Vigilante had been rendered permanently incapable of further harm, a final non-negotiable requirement for the survival of the vulnerable population he preyed upon. Yet, the shadow understood the precariousness of this position. Each action pushes the line further, demanding ever greater self-control to ensure the protector does not become the tyrant. The reflection was cold, devoid of self-pity, focusing solely on the metrics of success. The victims were safe, the organization crippled, the data secured. Epilogue: the quiet reshaping. Days bled into weeks. The media fed carefully curated leaks about major regulatory breaches and failed security protocols, spun the narrative into a story of corporate self-destruction. The vacuum left by Vigilante's disappearance was not immediately filled. The calculated data releases triggered a slow-motion cascade effect. Several large-scale infrastructure projects were frozen. City officials suddenly faced intense scrutiny over contract approvals, and the flow of illicit funds dried up, causing panic among the lower echelons of the network. The shadow watched the city breathe a collective, unconscious sigh of relief. The subtle shift in the urban ecosystem was palpable. A slight decrease in fear among certain communities, a reduction in the boldness of low-level criminal elements who relied on the systemic protection Vigilante offered. From the quiet solitude of the Eyrie, the shadow monitored the ripple effects, the digital ghosts of Vigilante's empire being systematically hunted down. The work was endless, meticulous, and thankless. There were no parades, no acknowledgements, only the stark reality of the ongoing commitment. The cost of maintaining this delicate urban stability was the complete erasure of a personal life, the constant vigilance, and the perpetual isolation. The shadow existed solely as a response mechanism, an invisible force operating outside the legal framework, yet dedicated to the purest form of justice the framework could no longer deliver. A final, encrypted message arrived on a secure channel, sourced from an independent, trusted intelligence asset deep within the city's legitimate power structure, a carefully cultivated relationship based on shared, unspoken goals. The message was brief, a single word indicating that the initial systemic shock had been absorbed, followed by a set of coordinates pointing to a new emerging threat, a rival faction attempting to absorb Vicente's remaining assets, threatening a chaotic turf war. The victory over Vigilante was officially closed, documented, and filed away. The psychological transition was immediate and necessary. The focus shifted entirely to the future threat. The shadow stood overlooking the sprawling metropolis, the lights twinkling like a vast, complex machine that required constant, skilled maintenance. The specialized suit, repaired and upgraded, lay ready. The internal moral calculus remained unchanged. The line between protector and aggressor was thin, maintained only by the absolute focus on the defense of the innocent. The necessity of the fight was the only justification required. The shadow inhaled deeply, the cool night air clearing the remnants of the previous confrontation. The pause was over. The city was safe for now, but the relentless, silent war against the forces that sought to exploit its vulnerabilities demanded immediate, renewed commitment. The shadow was ready, fading back into the deep, intricate shadows of the urban landscape, awaiting the moment to strike again, ensuring the stability purchased at such a high cost would be fiercely defended. The relentless cycle of vigilance had begun anew,